Hello, friends, and welcome to week 9 of our course and this preliminary lecture on executives or executive power within comparative politics. As always, you need to have read the textbook chapter, the lecture notes, and come to this lecture prepared because it will largely give you an overview of the issues. We'll have a lecture on the executive himself or herself in comparative politics, and we'll have a second lecture on bureaucracy in comparative politics, which is a very major topic. In both cases, the executive and bureaucracy, please see my YouTube channel just under Lee Cheek for background lectures using the American political system as background. This will be especially important for most of us when it comes to the bureaucracy because most of us have a rather limited background on bureaucracy, and especially when it comes to international affairs and comparative politics. Bureaucracy is a major institution that has tremendous control in almost all countries in the world and is both a challenge to political order and a supporter of existing orders and many other issues combined. So please review those lectures on YouTube, where really all of our other comparative politics lectures are also housed. So I urge you to look at those in advance, both on the American presidency and executive power and on bureaucracy. Okay, let's talk about the executive in comparative politics. And we call these executive institutions in our course. Many titles fit executive institutions: chief of state, chief executive, commander-in-chief, chief diplomat, chief negotiator, voice of the people, protector of the peace, manager of prosperity. Many of these titles, and these are also in the introductory lectures under American presidency in YouTube, so you can get a great view of those. And those change over time and are different in various countries. Basically, what we're talking about is a political executive. It's the highest branch of executive leadership. Usually it consists of a chief executive who is either elected or appointed or comes to power in some other manner. It also includes, and this is very important, is the bureaucracy, the uh, people who actually run the government on a day-to-day basis. They are a source of stability typically, but they also can be a source of change. Okay, let's talk about what the chief executive does, or some of the functions of a chief executive in comparative politics. One of those functions, and really looking at two main categories, is the idea of rule execution, carrying out or the making of laws and rules. The making of laws and rules is typically a legislative function, but the carrying out, the rule execution, is the role of the bureaucracy, of which the executive is the chief figure in overseeing bureaucracy. The other function, in addition to rule execution, is rule making. In the 21st century, very often executives make laws. This is what we call executive decision making. Or in America, an executive makes a pronouncement, executive made law. And this also happens in other countries, sometimes less formally and also not as well publicized and not as well open for revision and the overturning of such rules, typically by a legislature that would overturn a presidential decision. Another function of the executive is diplomacy. The president is, or the executive is the chief representative of a country overseas. That's the highest level of decision making that two countries can make, is when the chief executive of one country meets with the chief executive of another country. Another period, another way we tend to think about executive functioning is in emergency situations, emergency leadership. It's the role of the chief executive. The people of a country turn to a chief executive to help resolve emergency crisis, whether it be a natural disaster, whether it be war, whether it be a domestic instability of some form or the other. Another function is budgeting. Budgeting is one of the most central elements of any government. And it is the chief executive who actually administers a budget. Typically, the legislature in a democratic setting creates the budget, has the power of the purse. It's the executive who has the power of the sword, so to speak, who carries out that budget. In more authoritarian and totalitarian governments, the executive may be the key decision maker, may be the only decision maker. Also, typically in comparative politics, the executive commands the armed forces. The executive is the commander in chief of a country's military forces. And many times, executives come from, particularly in authoritarian and totalitarian countries, come from the military because they have proven leadership, they have support, they also have the relationship with the military, and that allows them to assume power and have some influence. Another function is chief administrator. The executive in any state, whether it be a democratic or authoritarian or totalitarian government, usually is the person ultimately responsible for the actions of government. And if you want to think of it in another regard, the chief executive, the executive is also like the chairman of the board in a business context, is really responsible for the decision making, the supervision, and curbing the excesses, perhaps, of the government. It's also a function of the executive to be the policy initiator, especially in our world, in contemporary international politics. The chief executive is often the person who begins policy discussions and creates policy discussions. Even though in most democracies, as we've just talked about, that's the role of the legislature, many times in contemporary politics, this takes place under the auspices of the executive. So please keep that in mind. Also, another function is the executive serves as kind of the symbolic leader of a country and can often be a unifying force. And that's a frequent argument that executives use, but in reality, people tend to defer to the executive when they talk about a country. You tend to talk about the executive who is in power as the leader of the country, even though the country may be in some turmoil, the executive may not have complete support. That still is the way we discuss that. Also, there's to shift gears again, to bring up another point, the different types of political executive leadership. To give you some idea of the different types, we'll begin with what we call the dictatorial model. This would be where you have a monarch. This has been the prevailing system throughout all of human history. We have one person who comes to power through a either hereditary means or somebody who comes to power through military conflict or just naturally rises to power politically within the institutions of the country. We call it the dictatorial model, where they have really total control of the government. They are the central figure. They are absolutist in the sense that they have all the power. These can be, as we mentioned, monarchies, military, political dictators who come to power. There are many models of that in the world that we could look at. Saudi Arabia, North Korea, a number of African regimes where we could look at as well. And these are people who typically rule for life until their government is overthrown. Second model, and this is a democratic model, the predominant democratic model we call the prime minister. Prime minister is part of a parliamentary form of government. That's where you can have two houses. We talked about the legislature or legislative models in week 8. Now we're talking about the same type of form of government, but the executive in that form of government. In a parliamentary form, the legislature, typically the lower house, the more popular house, the House of Commons, elects the executive. There are a number of advantages to this system, that it is the majority party in the lower house that elects the executive. Therefore, the executive always has a majority of the legislature, the House of Commons most commonly, or something, or a similar name, elects the legislature. So he or she always has the majority of the legislature on their side. That's very different than the American system, which we'll talk about in just a moment, and which you've already studied in your collegiate career. Most democracies have a parliamentary form of government. America is the oddball. There are a few others like us, but we're basically the oddball. The largest democracy in the world, India, has a parliamentary system. Japan has a parliamentary system. Great Britain, our mother country, has a parliamentary system. Other countries have different names for their parliamentary chief executive, but Britain uses Britain's executive is called the prime minister. In Germany, it's called the chancellor. In France, he or she is known as the premier. In America, while we are a democracy or a republican form of government, more accurately, we have a presidential system where we have a Congress, House and Senate, elected on their own terms, and then the presidency, the president is also elected separately. So you could conceivably have a president of one party and a Congress dominated by another party. And we call that divided government in American political science and in comparative politics as well. But that tends to slow down in the minds of some political scientists decision making, which may not always be bad. Slowing down government, forcing more reflection is not really always a bad idea. But a presidential system is very different in that the president is elected separately, or either elected through a medium like the Electoral College or elected directly. Some examples of a directly elected president in a presidential system would be the United States being the most prominent example in the world, the Philippines, and Mexico. All these deserve your consideration. Okay, so we've talked about dictatorial, prime minister, presidential systems. We'll move on to what I call in the lecture notes a hybrid system, where there's a mixture of parliamentary and presidential elements. For example, Germany and France may be called examples of a hybrid system in that they'll have several executive figures. One always has more power than the other, but they may be elected in different ways. A fifth example is what we call a communist system, where somebody just rises to power in the Communist Party, which is the only party, a totalitarian model. And this person has usually an unlimited reign of power until some other factors come in and intervene. The most prominent example of that is China. And I would urge those of you who are writing your papers on China to spend some time looking at that. A sixth model will be what we call the plural executive. This is where you have more than one executive. This idea is not completely foreign to the United States. In fact, at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Edmund Randolph, who would be the governor of Virginia later on, proposed 3 presidents. John C. Calhoun, right before the Civil War, said, if we don't have any other options, we're running out of ideas, let's have a plural executive. And then so you have more than one executive who has to agree, but that's typically not been very successful as a plan of action. We also talk in the notes about a junta system, where you have a group of people who run, and they typically all have to agree before any decision is made. And usually this is only in a very chaotic political and social environment. In terms of other aspects of the executive in comparative politics, the lecture notes talk about the chief executive, head of state, and head of government. These are two different roles that you'll need to study and need to think about. Um, the head of government is usually the person who runs the everyday affairs of the regime and is also the person who is most powerful. Head of state is largely symbolic and somebody who, while having a certain amount of the power in no way equals that of the head of government. So you can have both of these in the same country. So please keep that in mind. Head of state, head of government. Okay, making a transition to a different topic we need to discuss is what limits the power of the executive in comparative politics. Are there limits? We've talked about some situations where the executive has all the power without limits. What are the limits? Well, in a democracy, most commonly, the limits, and this does not apply to authoritarian, totalitarian governments, is term limits. The United States president can, under the 22nd Amendment, can serve 2 terms or 10 years. 10 years being if a president was president were to die in office after 2 years, the vice president can serve those 2 remaining terms and then been elected twice. That's never happened. Other countries have longer periods of time. Most countries have a longer period of time than 4 years. And of course, in an American democracy, the president can be defeated after 4 years, or be impeached or removed. There's other types of issues. But most democracies have in a presidential system especially, have a term limit. In a parliamentary system, the term limit is whether or not your party in the more popular branch of the legislature can stay in power. If not, if you lose election, you're no longer the prime minister, or no longer the chancellor, or no longer the leading figure in that system. Also, from a purely political science perspective, the president must also remain popular, especially in a democratic order, continue to be elected, or his or her party in a parliamentary system continue to be elected. And of course, that person is the leader in a parliamentary system takes responsibility for the party's success. They stay in power, also take responsibility. If they lose, they step down and they form a new government. Also, the law itself, the rule of law, says, hey, um, uh, there are certain limits to presidential power. They cannot be abused. If you use this power, you may lose. Um, and then this notion of the political tradition of the country or its rules for representation. Again, while parliamentary systems don't always have term limits, they do have the reality of politics is that one party will not always stay in power in the legislature, not always be able to elect as prime minister. When it comes to polling in democracies, the rule of thumb is that people are fickle. They will change their minds over a period of time. Economic conditions also can force changes in terms of the approval rating of the executive or the executive's party that will influence the term of office of the executive. Also, uh, finally, the structure of individual governments sometimes influence the term of office. Um, Many times there'll be self-imposed limitations. Some presidents or prime ministers may say they're going to serve a particular amount of time to serve a particular problem, and and therefore there'll be sort of self-imposed limitations. Final limitation is just public opinion and mass media, especially in democracies. But this can happen even in authoritarian regimes, where the people become either disinterested or disapproving of the executive, and they can put pressure on the executive to step down, pressure on the country to select new leadership, and many times this can be based upon the disapproval of the executive's performance in office. Is usually what happens, or other circumstances, um, and this is very often the place. Okay, how do executives function? How do they rule? How do they control their governments? Well, one of the mechanisms they use in terms of day-to-day rule is the bureaucracy, but they also depend on typically an inner group of advisors. And those advisors are called a cabinet. Not a piece of furniture, but a group of leaders and advisors, sometimes with a long association with the executive, that help him or her make decisions, manage the government, and rule. So make sure that you have looked over the role of cabinets in comparative politics. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of lecture 1 on the executive in comparative politics. We'll turn to a second lecture now, looking at some other aspects of the executive and the bureaucracy. Thank you very much. Continue to study hard, and I look forward to our continuing dialogue. Thank you.